and I'm going to talk about Russian cameras today. What people forget a little bit is how expensive cameras were, film cameras. And when I was just getting into photography in the 1970s, early 80s, a camera was the cheapest camera was about 15 to 20 pounds. Boots did a really horrible little, I think it was called a Boudica or something, and that was about 12, 14 pounds. If you wanted to begin to get a camera which took 35mm and was sharp, you could look at the Russian cameras. I think then Zenith E was about £55. That was when a pint of beer was 40 pence. So in comparison, though £50–60 might not seem a lot now, when you were only paying 40–50 pence for a pint of beer, and a Mars bar I think was 10p, then in relative terms cameras were expensive. And my first 35mm camera that I bought was a Zoki, and it was a model like this, and I paid the ground sum of £27, and for that I bought this in 1979, and this, you can tell the age of the Zokis because on the back is a number, and that number, the serial number, the first two numbers are the year. So this is a Zoki 4K made in 1977. It's a rangefinder camera, so you basically have a double image. You focus until the two images come together. There is no light meter, so you've either got to have a separate light meter, which I had a Russian light meter, Leningrad, or you work on the principle, if it's very, very bright, it's going to be about 16, if it's not so bright, 8, dull 4, very dull f2. And you've got manual shutter speeds here. These cameras all started by the Russians copying the Leica just before the war, in about 1938–39. The story is that the Leica copyright didn't extend to Russia, and Russia could make Leica copies without any problems. And they had two manufacturers, Zoki and Fed, producing cameras which look just like a Leica. I've had them before. If you find a Zoki 1 or a Fed 1, it's a camera very similar to the Leica, and it's based on the Leica. After the war, the factories slightly separated, and there was a factory near Moscow which made Zokis, and one in the Ukraine, I believe, which made Feds. The Zoki, I'll start with the Zoki story. The Zoki 1 was exactly like a Leica. The Zoki 2 began to be a bit different. Zoki 3 slightly higher. Then we got to the Zoki 4. This is actually a 4K. The 4 still retains the slightly hard work angle of having to rind on, where the 4K you have the deluxe of actually a lever rind, and that is basically the only main difference between the 4K and the 4. The slightly odd thing was they went on to do a 5, and then in the early 60s they even did a 6. And here is a 6. It's very clearly labelled as 6. You've got a lever rind, and what is quite different about this camera is it actually has a hinged back, where both these Zokis have a back, just let me ensure there's no film in here, a back which comes off like so. Now, The shutter is the focal plane shutter, so if you are using flash you have to make sure it's on the 60th or you will get odd lines. The greatest weakness of these cameras is often the shutter, and in particular the blinds, which can leak. I have had them serviced in the past and even sent them to Russia, and had a superb guy in Russia who used to fit new blinds. The odd thing was, as I said about the Zoki 6, this model was made in '63. They then somehow went back and still for sure produced the 4K for many years, and they actually stopped producing the Zoki 6, and this went on I think until about 1980, 81, maybe even longer. But that's the Zokis, very much based on the Leica. I think I did forget was the lens is the Leica 39mm lens. You can get other lenses, but you will then need an attachment for the viewfinder. Always wind on before changing the shutter speed. Many Zoki has been killed by people not winding on and then changing the shutter speed. They don't like it. Must wind on, then change. Okay, very important. They are heavy. I couldn't wait to get onto a SLR. I thought these when I was about 18. I appreciated the high quality of the image. The shutter speed is great in that it will go up to 1000. The lens, they often come with a Jupiter 8 or Industra. The Jupiter 8 I found they do vary from lens to lens a bit, but I found to be a fantastic lens, really sharp and fast at f2. Cases were always quite nice, but not very practical in that the case used to set up the shutter. Heavy, but very sharp, and it's a bit like a classic car. It might not be the most perfect design, it might not be the most efficient, but there's something about using them. There is a quality to them, there is a sharpness to them, there's a sort of procedure, and there's a manner with them. That's the Zoki. Maybe doing a bit much on this one, but I'm going to look at the Fed a little bit. The Fed was on the homemade, well, they were made in a different factory. They started by looking like the Leica, then this is the Fed 2. You see this one still has its collapsible lens, which is very similar in appearance to the Leica lens. 3.5, so not the fastest. Little bit more simple, I think, than the Zoki. This has no speeds. This is there are different models of the Fed 2. This is a relatively early model, I think. They then began to try to make the Fed a little bit more sophisticated. It became a little bit higher. The viewfinder became bigger. And I'm going to go straight on to the Fed 5. Am I going to go to the Fed 5? No, I'm going to go to the Fed 4 next. I haven't got a Fed 3 at the moment, but the Fed 4, you can see how bigger the camera is. It is bigger, but this time we actually have a light meter. And do we have slower speeds? No, we don't really have any slow speeds, but we do have a light meter. And again, at the rangefinder, it is a slightly more bulkier camera, but the light meter definitely makes life a lot easier. They are heavy. I've had a film in recently on this one. You've got a nice rind on. They are just, I think, a little bit more clumsy than the Zoki, but maybe I've used a lot of Zokis and like them. These are a little bit heavy. Having said that, at the end of the Fed run, back in as late as I think it was about 88 or even 90, they launched the 5B and the Fed 5, and these were lighter. The Fed 5 actually has a light meter. This is a 5B and it hasn't got a light meter, but what it has is this wonderful, we can actually just wind the film back like that at the end. Oh, I forgot to say that to release the sprockets, you've got to press all of these, you've got to press in and slightly rotate them a bit, which can be a bit of a pain, but I'm sure you can cope with. So we've got a nice wind back and a figure here. Okay. Buying them. They often turn up at car boot sales. Problem that you need to check. You need to check the shutter first. The other thing that often seizes up is the rangefinder, but there is a little bit of a easy fix on the rangefinder. Sometimes there's just a little bit stiff there, and I would be very, very careful using any lubricants, but perhaps a little bit on the matchstick and then just on the end there will free it up. As I said, big word of caution, people get over enthusiastic with WD-40, don't, you will ruin the camera, but perhaps just a little bit can often free the camera, free the little mechanism here. And there we are. Zokis and Feds, as I said, can be bought quite cheaply. How much to pay? Car boot sale, £10 to £20. Maybe if you really, really want one, it's mint, perhaps 25, 30. Online between 20 and 50, depending. The Fed one, Zoki ones can go as much as £100. There is a very good supply from Ukraine, from Russia. You do have to pay quite a bit for postage, but quite often the cameras have actually been serviced and cleaned and adjusted. So they are interesting. I wouldn't have one as my main camera, but as a bit of a hobby, as they are fun to use, interesting, and they make you think. Find a Zoki or a Fed.